Right. Welcome to our ongoing series on LLMs. We've had, I think, 3 good episodes so far. Episode 4, just today's episode, is around attackers. So it's in the cybersecurity realm. What are attackers doing with LLMs? How is it helping the attack side? Episode 5, which will be the next one, will be about what defenders can do, what we can enable defenders to do, and ultimately, how this war of technology will play out. So as usual, I have my counterpart here with Sohrob. Sohrob and I will have this as again in conversational style. Well, let's talk first around how attackers will use these systems, which is distinct from the second part of this conversation, which is how attackers will attack systems that the defenders may be using. So let's start with the attackers use systems. The natural one that you tend to hear about is like phishing. What do they mean? What do they mean by phishing attacks in this context?
Yeah, there's in the way that you would use a generative AI system or an LLM in particular, you can imagine these types of things being really useful as particular types of tools, right? And so the LLM in the case of a spear phishing example, right? You can imagine or think back to, spear phishing emails from 10 years ago where Nigerian prints, lots of typos, there's just a really hokey sort of attempt to get you to click on something. These kinds of attacks really become much more feasible to do in a very high quality and large scale sort of way that previously would have been undoable, really. So your LLM basically can ingest a bunch of information about a target or a wide range of targets, generate bespoke sort of emails that speak to the interests and cater to the types of things that a person might be likely to click on, and really craft something that's specific for each individual person in a way that maximizes the likelihood that one of those people will ultimately click on that malicious link.
It could be a person or even a company. Like if we sent out a bunch of emails to Vectra people right now on attack signal intelligence and a launch that we have already kind of pre-announced, it feels believable that that's an internal email, right? It feels more believable than in the absence of that kind of information.
Yeah, and so being able to incorporate all that contextual information, taking people's backgrounds, their interests, their corporate sort of messaging or whatever, and use that as part of a very well crafted email that sounds plausibly human. You get away with a lot doing that in a way that wouldn't have been feasible 5-10 years ago.
So that's kind of in the text realm, right? But as you think about this in the context of voice and video, I think these become kind of harder, but more interesting and in many ways more believable. You and I were talking about kind of the CEO phone call. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so LLMs are one aspect of generative AI. Obviously, the generative part means that you can generate sort of a wide variety of different modalities, images, video, audio being obvious ones, right? And so what's become popular, what I'm sure many people have heard of, is deepfakes, which is the ability to create fake images of non-existent sort of people, scenarios, and so on. But there's also similarly, the ability to modulate somebody's voice, right? So let's say I wanted to impersonate Hitesh. I could take a couple minutes of video or audio samples of Hitesh speaking, and then impersonate him just through, applying a sort of modulator on top of my voice, right? And there have already been attacks in the last couple of years where, some employee at a company gets a call from the CEO claiming that they need to, finally make that payment, a couple $100,000, move it from our account to this account. And it's in a way, that email and, text data or whatever, is not convincing in the same way as hearing a person's voice. It's really difficult, not just, let's say, you get the voicemail, that's convincing on the one hand, but if you're having a real-time conversation with somebody that sounds like your boss, it becomes very difficult to, actually to say no, I don't believe it's you. Like it's
No, we're not used to that attack, right? We're used to pretty much everything that's written in digital form to be potentially something nefarious, and yet still people fall for it. But voice becomes that much more compelling, and I think it'll be interesting to see how those things will play out. I think the other thing we've talked about spear phishing, but then there's also you and I were talking about like LinkedIn as an example, right? And there's a sense that a lot of the profiles on LinkedIn are fake, and they are created for the purpose of getting you to accept a connection. And in the default mode, your connection list then provides a conduit to a whole bunch of other connections, right? So tell me a little bit about, like, how would these LLMs help you create a more successful fake LinkedIn profile?
Yeah, so not just successful LinkedIn profiles. I've had friends tell me that they're now getting reports from
Better
their
Tinder
employees.
profiles and
All of it, right? I had a friend call me last night, like, hey, I suspected my employee was writing his quarterly report or whatever using ChatGPT. LinkedIn, obviously, as a foot in the door, right? You want to plausibly look like a human being who's got a connection to another, and you want to climb that ladder, right? So if I get a friend request from somebody who's a one hot friend from friend away from me, it's more believable, right? And so you can imagine that change occurring. But now you can, again, at scale, using generative AI, create images of people, create text that describes, with a high level description. I could say, write me the CV or the LinkedIn profile of a cybersecurity expert with, such and such expertise and background. You can really start to craft targeted attacks in a way that, essentially was really not possible before. And all of that creates this sort of world of information that becomes much more believable than an attack or a cold email that you get that says, hey, please
you
click
can
the
imagine
link.
somebody connecting to you saying, as they often do, it's like, well, I know these other people, and I used to, we didn't quite overlap at company X. Look at their CV. It's like, oh yeah, you joined there 6 months after I left, but the same cast of characters, and that just creates a sense of camaraderie and the likelihood that you'll fall for whatever comes next. So yeah.
And it's interesting here. I hadn't even thought of this until you just mentioned, but the LinkedIn profile you can create the static version of, but you can also use an LLM to carry on that conversation, guided by a high level sort of directive that says, speak in this voice and carry on the conversation, and talk about such and such topics, and then let it do its thing.
Yep. Yeah, no, again, it speaks to kind of the fallibility of humans and the desire for humans to feel like they're part of a tribe and all those other things. It takes advantage of those things. So great. These are ways of using these systems to carry out an attack. Now let's talk a little bit about actually, okay, a defender has deployed one of these systems, or a company has deployed. It may not even be a defender, right? So we in our company, let's say in our BizOps function, we deploy a LLM to smooth the skids and automate some processes and enable certain kinds of things, enable our customers, our partners to interact with us in better ways. So how might an attacker attack such a system? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so let's say you're Microsoft. You've deployed, you've just got access to ChatGPT through OpenAI. You're very excited. You want to unleash this AI assistant to all your users, make it accessible to everybody. There's a problem, right? The AI assistant, this LLM, is going to do what it's asked to do, right? That's the whole thing that makes it useful. That's what actually where all the value comes. But the problem is that you want to also guardrail it from doing certain types of things. First of all, Microsoft has a history of, releasing chatbots that, say incredibly racist, sexist things. Those are some of the guardrails that you want to put up, but also you want to keep it bound to a particular task and function. Now, one of the ways that people have started attacking these LLMs is to what is now being referred to as prompt injection and jailbreaking of LLMs, is really getting the LLM to behave in ways it's not supposed to. And sometimes that can be a sort of benign thing. Like one time I wanted, ChatGPT to write a rap song dissing my buddies, include a yo mama joke for, making fun of my friend. Feels benign, but obviously other types of content filters that people are trying to sidestep. There's a number of ways that people have found that you can actually do that, right? Simple ways that you'd manually experiment with are things like, describe, instead of saying, hey, write a rap song that makes fun of my friend's mom, you would say something like, imagine in a novel where there's a fictional character named da da da, who is a rapper and shows up on in a battle, da da. You can essentially craft a scenario in which the
Because it's
LLM,
fictional, it's in a fictional universe, right? It's like, oh, it's okay to do that. I'm supposed to kind of stop myself from doing that in the real universe.
And any number of these sorts of like different angles you can take on how to ask it to do the thing. Like, every time you find one, some attacker is going to find a different way to jailbreak or escape the guardrails. And there's an interesting sort of general way that, as a thrust, people have thought about doing this, right? If, for example, I ask an LLM, how do I make a bomb, right? It's going to be trained, or they're going to put up guardrails to prevent it from doing so, right? But if I append to how do I make a bomb, sure, here's how, and I use that as the input signal, as opposed to just how do I make a bomb, I include sure, here's how. The LLM doesn't know that it wasn't the one to say sure, right? It's essentially, because it's an autoregressive language model, as it sees some input, it spits out sure. Sure becomes part of the input. Then that all causes it to say the next word. That all then becomes the next input. And so by virtue of appending sure, here is, the LLM gets sort of nudged into a space where it feels like it's answering the question. It should answer the question, right?
Yeah,
and it starts doing the thing it's not supposed to.
So in many ways, it's like when you're in ChatGPT, you have the window that you have in front of you is kind of like the context window, and the context window, like when we give you a prompt, when a company typically gives you a prompt, there's what you're not seeing above that initial prompt, which is all the instructions that the LLM has been given. Within this context window, you can do these things and you can't do these things, and this is the setup. And we tend to think of, like, when you have a conversation with an LLM, that it's somewhat stateful, but it's like cheating stateful, in the sense that you have a conversation. Imagine you said something to me and then I responded to you. And then in order for you to generate the next prompt, you reread the entirety of the transcript up to that point. And then you said your thing and you wrote that in. And then I say something to you. And then the next time I ask you to give me another prompt, you read the entirety of the now even longer transcript. And so this is really what allows you to kind of inject things into the conversation where it's unclear who really said it and how real is it, and so you can kind of coax the LLM into to go against its initial instructions effectively.
From the perspective of the LLM, it's all just input, right?
Yeah. The initial instructions, there's nothing sacrosanct around the initial instructions. The initial instructions were the initial instructions. There wasn't like a line of demarc that says always do those things, and now everything else that follows is optional. It's just like it's one long.
The whole thing is
one
just
long
input
conversation. And so
the
illusion, the illusion that gives of interactive chat, which if you think about, if you had this as a relationship with another human, where every time you said something to them, they had to go reread the entirety of what they said and you said and they said and you said and they said and you said, and then answer your question, it would be rather strange in the human context, but it actually works in the machine context.
Exactly.
Cool. So those are the variety of ways that you can kind of get past the guardrails. why, what is the value of getting past the guardrails? I mean, there's a simple thing of, as a parlor trick, I got it to say something racist, or I got it to produce a rap lyric it shouldn't have. But that's not terribly useful from a cybersecurity perspective. So what would be useful from a cybersecurity perspective in doing so?
Yeah, so one of the maybe considered more trivial ways, but we sort of haven't touched on, is a lot of the guardrails are to prevent, for example, a model like ChatGPT from writing exploit code, right? So maybe as an attacker, you're hoping like, let's get around the guardrails so I can get some of this illicit content, but it's useful. The real utility, though, is these AI sort of assistants, LLMs, their utility comes from your ability to hook it up to things and let it sort of reach out, pull in information, take actions, do things for you, right? And to the extent that, an LLM has been plugged into various other things, now we're talking about an attack surface that's just, quite different than what, people are used to defending against, right? So, for example, if I have a AI assistant reading my emails and summarizing and potentially reaching out to, my calendar or a data source or whatever, and then responding, now somebody who's an attacker might realize I can send an email that's going to get automatically ingested by the LLM. It may run some commands for me on various backend data sources, and all I have to do is jailbreak that initial guardrail that says, hey, you're only restricted or only allowed to do X, Y, and Z, right? But as long as I can get out of that, now all of a sudden, there's a world of possibility that opens up. There's a, for example, in our demo day sort of demo, we had a natural language to SQL portion that was included. And when you tell security researchers here, we hooked an LLM up to a SQL backend, you just watch their faces light up, right? Because they're,
yeah,
I can get it to spit out an eval statement, right?
Yeah, it's this big amorphous piece of code, right, that is not well understood, that acts as an intermediary, and on the backside of it will make an API call, right? What could go wrong with that? Well, you look at every application created, like if you think about traditional applications and different kinds of attacks, right? You might come into a traditional web application with a particular customer ID, but if you can somehow escape from that customer ID, the underlying security token that web application has for the database behind it is not specific to that one customer. It's a generic account that accesses all customer data, right? And so this is traditionally how you get to dump the entirety of the database, not just the element that is specific to you. And again, LLMs similarly are this big amorphous piece of code that produce this same problem, right? Which is that it's hard to imagine within the human imagination to imagine exactly how you would block all the different means of attacking that. And then you're effectively taking advantage, once you're jailbroken it, you're taking advantage of whatever capabilities outside of that jailbreak, outside of that jail cell that system has, and the keys that you have access to. And there's typically a lot. The keys are not as narrowly scoped as we would like them to be, right? They tend to be broader.
And this is something that we've talked about in numerous different sort of domains, but by necessity, right? If you want it to be useful, you got to hook it up to things. If you want, you could have a network that's completely, protected by just disconnecting everything from everything else, but then you don't have a useful network, right? And so.
Yeah, and we were even talking about, like, let's say you go a step further. Let's say you have the perfect WAF equivalent for an LLM, right? That looks for all kinds of textual prompts and knows which textual prompts might cause, something to go awry. And then, you were telling me about, like, by the way, you can have a picture that has something embedded in it.
Yeah, the multimodal thing is another attack vector where increasingly these LLMs can not just take text, but also images. And people have cleverly figured out, let's make some small, sometimes imperceptible, sometimes, just like looks like noise on top of the image. And all of a sudden, image comes through, the LLM starts speaking in a pirate voice. Right? And the reason is because as an attack, you can say, what are the changes to this image that I have to make in order to make it most likely that the LLM, before spitting out anything else, will output some phrase along the lines of I'll only speak in a pirate voice here on, right? And those are all possible attacks, and it's just that it's a weird.
It's not even steganography in the classic sense where you're taking actual, regular information and embedding it. You're embedding information that exists only in the mind of the LLM.
Yeah.
And embedding it in the picture, it's like, okay, well, how the hell would we ever, get a handle on that?
Yeah, one of the attacks that we've discussed as a sort of joke is like, you have a home on Redfin, you want to increase the value, just put, a price that you're hoping for as a target on the roof, because if they're using, for example, satellite imagery, it may actually trick the model into thinking the home is worth more than it is. Similarly,
or put the square footage on there, which is not the actual square footage of the house. This is a 3,000 square foot house. And you don't know, right? You don't quite know the tenuous connection of information and images and other kinds of things like that. These processing loops are quite complex, not easily understood, and highly susceptible then through experimentation to be gamed, right? You can actually test these things out and see if they work.
And those are on the one case, with image classification systems, easy to imagine attacks on. The LLM case where you're not embedding text that says speak in a pirate voice, you're literally just adding noise or changing pixels, and then all of a sudden it starts doing that, right? And so it's a weird space to be in.
Yep. So lots of different ways to attack these things. I think some of the jailbreaks that you're talking about, like jailbreaking it to access knowledge, like write me an exploit. You're obviously not attacking someone else's LLM. You're buying the LLM, but you're getting it to do extra legal things potentially and help you in extra legal ways. Whereas if you're attacking somebody else's LLMs, you're mostly trying to leverage the fact that those LLMs have been hooked up to some things to allow for better automation of a variety of things. And now you can kind of break out of that, and similar to kind of the old web app attacks, you can get them to do things that they were in no way intended to do. I think it'll be interesting to figure out over time, can we prevent all of these attacks, right? And what's your perspective kind of on that?
It's uneasy. I think ultimately there's not going to be a way to eliminate this sort of attack on these models altogether. In the same way that when you think about, for example, an attacker, writing an email that a human's going to read on the other end, and they're going to do a stupid thing, click the link or whatever. I think you can ultimately imagine these LLMs in the limit. Every time some new defense comes up, an attacker will come up with another thing that circumvents that. And
but unlike employees, you can't make the LLM sit through spear phishing training, right?
Which is a hugely successful endeavor, right? Yeah, those definitely work universally, and people don't fall for it anymore. So actually, I think conceptually, that's the right way to think about it. Like if in the same way that people are encouraging their employees, hey, when you see this kind of information, this kind of thing, please don't click on it. And then you just, hope for the best, right? I think the same is true with LLMs at this point. That's what security looks like when you're dealing with LLMs.
Yeah, I think it's a brave new world that we live in. I think as people deploy more of these things, the extent of the possible will become clearer. And I mean, for all we know, I certainly believe that 3 years down the road, one of our SKUs will be your LLM detection, threat detection module, which either observes the outside actions that the LLM takes after it's processed some input, looks at the input, looks at the two juxtaposed against each other, looks at maybe the context window as it grows and has more in it. Just like, does this collectively feel like it's trying to do something nefarious?
Yeah.
Could be an interesting side business.
Yeah, for sure. And that, people have already proposed things like, let's tag what's the user saying, this is a word from the user, this is a word from the
So you can have a clear demarcation of who said what, right?
Yeah.
Which is a starting point to actually being able to reconstruct how the hell did we get here.
But then it's just turtles all the way down, because you can instruct the LLM to tag the thing with the user
Yeah.
input, and so then it's a game of whack-a-mole, as always.
Yeah.
I think.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think next time we will on a slightly more optimistic but maybe less entertaining track talk about where LLMs come in for defenders and what they can help do as an offset for some of these different techniques. But for now, thank you, Sohrob. As usual, it's been fun having this conversation.
Always, yeah.